let's kind of dive into the Marshals aspect, if you don't mind. So, most of the Marshals were very successful, both in battle and in life. But how hard do you think it was for these men to work for such a high IQ taskmaster, such as Napoleon?
I think it must have been phenomenally hard. Napoleon was a very generous rewarder of good service, and nobody benefited from that more than the Marshals, apart from his siblings.
Mm-hmm.
But he was highly, highly demanding. I mean, one of Napoleon's real strengths was his inexhaustible energy. He slept very, very little, as little as 4 hours a night. He had a prodigious capacity for work. He had a real gift for, his memory was exceptional,
Yep.
and he
Yep.
would work in the bath, he would work in his carriage, he would eat extremely quickly at dinner time and then leave the table to go back to work. And he was concerned with everything. That there was no detail, as far as he was concerned, that was too small, because he was such a micromanager. He
Right.
was not a person who lent himself very easy to leisure, but he expected everybody to keep up with him. He could be phenomenally unsympathetic. If you think of Marshal Oudinot, who was in Holland when his wife died and was left with 7 motherless children, he requested to go back to France and had his request declined because Napoleon felt it was more important that he was in Holland.
Wow.
He didn't really understand that anybody would want to wind down. Massena famously didn't want to go to the peninsula. He'd been at war for something like, roughly 2 decades. He felt
Right.
he'd earned his leisure,
Mm-hmm.
and Napoleon insisted. So because he was a man of boundless energy, he expected everybody else to do likewise. And in as much as he could be incredibly generous in rewarding good service, he could be, really harshly critical when he felt somebody wasn't up to standard.
Yeah, and I think the Marshals enjoyed their titles and wealth. I mean, who wouldn't? But it's hard work for a perfectionist. And other than Bessier, Marshal and Berthier, I think most of the Marshals had a contentious relationship with the emperor. I
Mhm.
believe they all respected him. They had, but they on the other hand, they had many rows with him, most notably Murat, Ney, and MacDonald. Do you think they liked him personally?
I think he definitely had genuine friends in Marshal and Bessier, and Marmont obviously liked him as well, because in the early days he was one of Napoleon's first and dearest friends.
Mm-hmm.
He certainly was respected by a few of them. I mean, Davout respected him to the point of fanaticism,
Mm-hmm.
and he earned the respect of people like Lefebvre and Soult. But I think in some cases, like MacDonald, like Sonsier, like Bernadotte, they tolerated him because they thought he was what was best for France.
Mm-hmm.
Coming out of the tumult of the revolution had been eating itself, and then there was the corruption of the Directory, the military mismanagement, the slaughter of generals left, right, and centre every time the revolutionary government decided they were too zealous or not zealous enough. Napoleon sort of seemed to be the best of both worlds. He was somebody who could provide a sense of stability, but he was still a new man. He was still a man of the revolution. So I think you can understand why people felt, or the Marshals felt, he was the right man for the job at the time. But I don't think, I mean, a good chunk of them certainly, I don't think were his personal friends.
Yeah, and he was probably, like we were talking earlier, he was a hard man to get along with just because of
Mm-hmm.
his high demands. And you're right. I mean, even at dinner, he would only sit for, I think, 10 minutes at a time, when royalty in those days would have several hour dinners with many courses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's get into the nitty gritty now. And this is my favorite stuff because it's so debated on Twitter and anywhere else there's a chat room. Most overrated Marshal. There's 26 of them to choose from. I gave you some options in Murat, Ney, and Augereau, or did you have someone else in mind?
It's, for me, it's 100% Marshal Murat. I am not a fan at all.
But he was so flamboyant, and he had the nicest uniforms.
He was flamboyant. But his reputation gets away with a phenomenal amount, I feel, by virtue of being glamorous. He was very good if you wanted a cavalry charge. I mean, there's no disputing his skill as a cavalryman or his physical bravery, but he had no sense whatsoever. I mean, there's that quote from Savary that he would have been much better served with a bit less bravery and a bit more sense. He was vainglorious, he was rash, his judgment was very poor, and anytime Bernadotte and Marmont get mentioned in discourse online, inevitably somebody shouts traitors, traitors, grab the torch and pitchforks.
Right.
But Murat was one of the first to turn against Napoleon, and he had done better than anybody at the hands of his brother-in-law. He'd been made king, and he turned to look after his own interests.
Yeah, you wonder why he doesn't get flack when we mentioned traitors of Napoleon, because he was the first one, as you mentioned. Maybe just because he was shot by firing squad shortly after, or because he did it in Italy, far away from France.
Yeah, and as I say, I think by virtue of being so dramatic and glamorous, and having all that sort of dynamism in his story, I think he gets away with a little bit more than he deserves to. Right. Certainly for me, he's the most overrated.
Okay. Now we'll flip the script and we'll go most underrated. And again, I gave you 3 options. I had Marshal Suchet, Saint-Cyr, or Oudinot, who I know is one of your favorite. Or did you pick someone else?
No, I do think Suchet and Oudinot, I think, are generally underrated and they don't get as much credit as they deserve. Suchet obviously came to the baton fairly late, and then his reputation was burnished thereafter. He was one of the only marshals to leave Spain without, having enhanced his reputation rather than destroyed it. But when you look at his service actually in Italy, realistically, he had done as much as some of the other marshals who got the baton in 1804. He had given very good service. He, the fact that he had kept elements of the enemy down had contributed to the victory at Marengo, and that sometimes only gets assigned to Massena, who had tied up forces by holding out at Genoa.
Right.
But his service was actually very good indeed.
Yeah, in 1815, he pushed the Austrians back at the frontier there. Yeah, very talented.
And he was probably, with the exception of Bernadotte, the most politically savvy marshal, and that kind of came to bear fruit in Spain, because he was one of the few who understood that if you are going into the avenue of war that was Spain, which was fundamentally different from the campaigns they had fought in Western Europe, Central Europe, sorry, you couldn't use the same tactics. And he understood that the army had to be disciplined, that they had to, if not get the support of the Spanish people, at least try and establish some level of diplomacy or cooperation.
Yep.
And then you look at the success that he had in Spain compared to some of the others. And I know the areas themselves were obviously very different topographically and in terms of the battles, etc. as well. But he by far had the most sensible approach in Spain.
Agreed. Yeah, I think he worked really hard, just like you said, not to necessarily get the Spanish to like him, but at least to respect him and kind of the reforms he was making, letting the Spanish govern themselves. Like, I'll have the French troops out in the countryside, so we don't bother you. We're here, let's make the best of it type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, they still fundamentally were an invading army, but he understood that if you could establish some degree of cooperation rather than outright oppression, the result was going to be significantly better.
Indeed. My next question for you is, I think it's an easy one to answer, but I'll let you be the judge. Who had the best post-Empire career? So I'm talking after Napoleon's final downfall in 1815.
This one totally depends on your point of view and how you feel about monarchy, I think. Because if you feel that the crown or a crown is the ultimate prize and to be royal is the ultimate prize, then on that front, it has to be Bernadotte. But given that these were effectively self-made men, and I'm not a particular cheerleader for monarchy anyway, for me, it's actually Soult, and he was the real survivor of the Marshalate. He returned from the disgrace that he wound up in post Waterloo. He was then made a peer. He became Minister for War, held the foreign portfolio for a while as well, the foreign ministry. He was Prime Minister, and he actually enacted some really substantial reforms during his ministries. So he really accomplished something of note. And that's not to say Bernadotte didn't as King of Sweden, but for me, that achievement counts for more than a crown. And again, it totally depends on your point of view. If you're a monarchist, you maybe do feel that, for Bernadotte, having founded a still extant dynasty means he's the ultimate winner of the Napoleonic Game of Thrones. But for me, it's Soult.
Yeah, no, I agree with your point. I think Bernadotte did do some things once he became king. Like, obviously, he was very lucky how he became king. But once he got there, like, he kept Sweden out of wars. He was somewhat moderate, at least till the end there. And like you said, his dynasty still goes on to this day. So it just depends how you classify success, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, now your favorite topic, which I know you're dying to get to, the Marshals' wives. And you admired most of these ladies for their strength on the home front, while the Marshals were often on campaign. Which was your favorite / least favorite? I guess it's a two-part question.
Yeah, I find the Marshals' wives, the lives of these women were really interesting, and it's a shame that in that period, ultimately, unless you were royal, very often the women's stories get neglected. But my absolute favorite of the Marshals' wives was Madame Lefebvre, Catherine Hubscher. She was a laundress. She was illiterate when her husband married her. He taught her to read. And the thing I like about the Lefebvres, both of them, not just Madame Lefebvre, is that they never got carried away with the titles. They never believed themselves to be any different than what they were. They never forgot their roots. And Madame Lefebvre in particular was a very famously blunt speaker. She was a great maker of puns. She, in what we say in Scotland, was she called a spade a spade.
Yeah, she spoke her mind.
Yeah, she absolutely did. And Napoleon liked her as well. And he was somebody who could be phenomenally rude to women. He was very misogynistic, and he didn't always have a lot of time for women he didn't see a personal use in, but he was very fond of her. And on one occasion, when somebody rather snottily commented that it had pleased His Majesty to raise Madame Lefebvre to the title of Duchess, Napoleon kind of came to her defense and said, actually, it pleased me to raise the title of Duchess to Madame Lefebvre. And the two of them as a couple, they did an enormous amount of charity work. They supported less fortunate relations. And they also bore out a horrible amount of tragedy because they were predeceased by all 14 of their children, which is
terrible. Yeah.
It's something I can't even begin to get my head around. That level of tragedy.
And the one they lost in Russia, the son, I think that's just awful. Well, they had one that really made it to adulthood and was making something of himself, and tragically passed on the retreat from Russia.
Yeah. And even after all they'd lost, I mean, they ensured that there was a memorial built to their son where he's buried. After all they'd lost, she still continued to do effectively good work in the community. She was even after she lost her husband, she survived Lefebvre for numerous years. She was very generous. She was a very kind woman and a very sensible one. She was never caught up with, she never believed herself to be more than she was.
Right. She was kind to everyone except Marshal Bernadotte.
Yes, when he called on her after Waterloo, she said she was not at home to traitors and shut the door in his face.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, let me ask you the second part of the question. Which of these fine ladies was your least favorite?
So I'm going to be pretty consistent here, and it was Madame Murat, Napoleon's sister Caroline Bonaparte. And like a lot of the Bonaparte siblings, Caroline had all the Bonaparte vices, but none of her brother's talents. And she was, much like her husband, she was vain, she was greedy, she was spoiled, she was demanding. Want
to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere. and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I've really enjoyed the ease of use and the distribution ability of this platform.
He was unbelievably cruel to Josephine, as were all the Bonaparte women. And you know, she and Murat conspired to introduce Napoleon to potential mistresses with the hope that he would get one of them pregnant, so that Josephine would be thrown over.
I find it interesting that the more gifts and wealth Napoleon gave either the Marshals or his family members, the more likely they were to betray him or be rude to him or conspire against him. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, he really had the most horrific luck with his siblings. There's really not I mean, Eliza was, I guess you could say, potentially the best sister, even though she wasn't a particularly nice person.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they were horrible. They were two-faced. They were greedy. They were just awful siblings. And probably Caroline was the worst. You know, she threw tantrums over the coronation. She wouldn't carry Josephine's train. She demanded to be made an imperial princess. And then, having got all of that, she turned with her husband, you know, with a view to keeping her hands on their own thrones.
Yeah. And then,
that all came to nothing anyway.
Yeah, and I believe after Napoleon's downfall, her mom wouldn't talk to her anymore.
No. Yeah, I mean, probably also give an honourable shout out to the almost superhuman courage of Angelique, Madame Brune, because it was only through her searching for 2 years that Marshal Brune's body was found.
Yep.
And it was only through her further years of battling, and she wrote to everyone she could, including the king, that she had his cause of death changed from the blatantly fake suicide to murder, and that he was able to be finally given a Christian burial. And that's, you know, when you think she was a metal burnisher by trade when she married Brune, she was not a woman who was born to sort of great avenues of state, who wouldn't have been in the habit of, you know, writing to the great men of the day. The fact that she fought for so long and for so hard is incredible.
Yeah, there's certainly a book or a story to be told there. Just for her husband to serve France as he did. Now, you know, he had many faults, but for him to die the way he did was awful. And then the royal court to cover it up like that. Kudos to Angelique for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to our Marshals now. Why did Napoleon keep some of these guys that were past their prime, Augereau or Victor come to mind, or bunglers like Bernadotte and MacDonald, instead of promoting other talented generals, say Gerard, to Marshal status?
You know, that's a really interesting question, and it's quite a difficult one to speculate on. In some cases, I genuinely think Napoleon was quite a sentimental man. Pardon me, and he was also very conscious of the story that he was creating. In the roundtable debate we had just before Christmas about sort of Napoleon's reckoning on the Napoleon at War podcast, I kind of talked about the fact that one of Napoleon's real sort of ultimate victories was his skill as a communicator, and he wove his own myth. And I think it's part of the reason people still find him so fascinating today. And he understood the power of the victories that, you know, went into that myth making. And, you know, when people would criticize Augereau, he would say, yeah, but remember what he did for us at Castiglione. And I think he understood the power of those titles that he'd given and the victories they were linked to. So I think part of it was brand building, for want of a better expression. Part of it was sentiment, but I also think he was savvy enough to understand when it came to people like Bernadotte and MacDonald, who'd been associated with Moreau and Pichegru. He understood that it was better to have potential rivals or enemies closer to you and dependent on your kindness or generosity than it was to have them plotting against you.
Yeah, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
Yeah, I think he knew he couldn't afford to make an enemy of Bernadotte. Certainly not at the time he became, consul and at the start of the empire.
Yeah, and according to MacDonald's, again, this is MacDonald's biography, they asked him to be first consul first, or something like that.
Yeah, he certainly made that claim, but I think MacDonald did a slightly better opinion of himself than other people had of him. So I'm not sure how completely accurate that is.
Yeah. Okay, let me see. One more question I have for you, which is a big one because I've read 100 books on this. And then how are any of these guys still alive after so many battles? That was my question, because Oudinot and Grouchy had over 22 wounds, which means at least 22 times someone was very close to killing them. And those are just the ones I know about from the history books. All but 4 were wounded in battle at some time. Medical knowledge was limited, even though the marshals had surgeons. And Napoleon insisted that his marshals led from the front. Some like Ney and Murat did it with gusto. Others like Soult preferred to be in the rear. But of the 26 marshals, only 3 died as a result of battle. Lannes, Bessières, and Poniatowski, representing only 12%. I think this is amazing, considering there are hundreds of battles in the Napoleonic Wars. What is your feeling on that?
I mean, I think honestly, just absolute sheer luck is the reality, because when you think of Oudinot in particular, I mean, his wounds, he was at least 34, possibly as many as 37.
Right.
And when you think that he got shot 3 times in the chest in 1 year, he took 3 bullets to the chest, and in another battle, he took saber wounds to the neck. So these aren't scratches we're talking about either. These were really substantial wounds.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't have wanted to stand next to him on a battlefield. He was a bullet magnet.
Yeah.
And most of the others, they were injured at least once. I think Massena was one of the few who didn't get a battlefield wound, but then he got shot in the face by Napoleon, who blamed Berthier and lost one of his eyes. But it was, I think, honestly, sheer luck, because probably most of them could have gone the way that Lannes did, because it wasn't his wound that killed him, it was the infection.
Yeah.
Bessières, he died instantly, and Poniatowski drowned. But to not have picked up infection and to not have died that way, it really is a phenomenal amount of luck, really.
Yeah, I think the Oudinot one, where he was in Russia getting treated for one wound, and then didn't the cabin collapse on him that he was getting treated in.
Yeah, so they had removed him. He was actually lying in, on a sort of makeshift bed, and he was still recovering because he'd been wounded at Polotsk, and then he'd been wounded again, and his son was with him, and the cabin was surrounded by Cossacks, and Oudinot said, well, if they're going to take me, they'll know who they're taking, and stood up or struggled sort of semi to his feet and got his pistols to shoot through the window. And they hit the roof of the cabin, which dislodged a beam, which came down and struck him on the head. And it's almost pure slapstick. Like if you showed that on a TV series, people would think you were doing it for almost comedic effect, but he still survived it.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me. And Ney, at Waterloo, was courting death, riding up and down, getting horses shot out from under him. It's just fascinating to me that these guys braved death so many times. And that's probably why with Murat and Ney at the firing squad, they didn't need a blindfold. They're just like, I'm not afraid of death.
Yeah, I think they'd faced it too many times to be afraid of it.
So I guess kind of wrapping up, like what I learned, I found something that I liked about almost every marshal except your friend Victor, who we both despise.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah, they're all warmongers who I understand they spread death and destruction as per Napoleon's war machine. I get that. but they all did their job to the best of their abilities and were outnumbered in many of their pitched battles. And I found as I researched examples of kindness, Bessier giving up his staff dinner to starving citizens in Moscow was something I didn't know about. Lefebvre working his retirement years to help wounded or poverty-stricken veterans. What did you think of these men, both on and off the battlefield?
Yeah, I think undeniably all 26 deserved a baton for one reason or another. Napoleon wasn't in the habit of rewarding idiots, with the exception of his siblings. And they all genuinely deserved a baton at one point or the other. Some of them were phenomenal generals, Davout, Massena, Lannes, and had a real talent for independent command. Some of them, like Oudinot, like Ney, worked best when under Napoleon's overall direction. But yeah, they represented some of the finest generals of the era. And one of the things that really draws me to their stories, there's nowhere else at that time you would look and see such a group of generals from such a diverse socioeconomic background, because command was the privilege of the ruling classes everywhere else.
Yeah.
Off the battlefield, I sometimes think there's a sort of erroneous picture that gets painted of the Marshals, that they were all greedy, looting, backstabbing, quarrelers, and they certainly did. They could quarrel with the best of them. But when you actually read into some of their stories, quite a lot of them were very honourable men. When you look at the likes of Davout, who literally put his life on the line trying to save Ney after Waterloo, saying, I was Minister for War, I demand to take the blame on myself. When you look at, as you say, Lefebvre, somebody who, despite phenomenal personal loss, never forgot where he'd come from, never got carried away with the title and the wealth, was never concerned about lining his pockets, and actually was focused on doing good in his community, supporting other people. When you look at, the honour of Oudinot, who, during Waterloo could have, played either side and ultimately said, I swore an oath, it means something, but since I will not serve you, sir, I'll serve nobody. And just, withdrew. There's actually a lot more stories of honour among the Marshalate than I think sometimes people believe.
I agree. And I think they all had survival instincts as a group. Clearly they all navigated the madness of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. And a lot of their early lives, many of them lost a parent as a young child. And I think that taught them to kind of overcome obstacles in their life.
Yeah, there's a prevailing theme, actually. The vast majority, well, not the vast majority, but a significant number of them lost their fathers very young. And I guess if psychologists would maybe read into that and make, conclusions, which obviously are beyond my pay grade, but it's an interesting theme.
Yeah.
That they were then all drawn to such a sort of formidable personality as Napoleon.
Yeah, Marshal Jourdan lost both parents at a young age. And yeah, I know, I've read stories, Malcolm Gladwell in his book, of the first 44 U.S. presidents, 12 lost a parent at a young age, and they overcame it. So I think all of these successful Marshals had seen the worst, whether it was the loss of a parent or the Reign of Terror. But many of the Marshals and the Emperor himself, who lost his dad at a young age.
And Wellington.
Yeah, and Wellington, that's right. Overcame it to kind of navigate these, I guess, unprecedented times.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is remarkable about Lefebvre is one of my favourite. I feel he's the most likeable, him and Mortier. It's an era that's replete with great, in inverted commas, great men. But some of the Marshals were good men. And, I look at Lefebvre and Mortier as real examples of that. And I think it was one thing to have battlefield courage, but some of them also had significant moral courage. And I think that's just as admirable.
Right. And not to whitewash anything, some of them were bad men. I mean, Marshal Victor, he just seemed like a guy who needed to tell everyone in the room how important he was.
Oh, I hate Victor. I really do.
I know you did.
Well, I mean, also Messina and Silt, you wouldn't have trusted them with anything valuable as far as you could have thrown them because they stole everything.
Everything,
Yeah.
and Brune as well. Yeah.
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 And Ojiro was a devil for looting as well. So yeah, some of them were greedy, and yes, some of them could argue within it, start an argument in an empty room. But it was a very interesting mix of characteristics.
Do you feel the narrative that they didn't cooperate or get along? Now, obviously, they're all big egos; they're all competing with each other. But just researching it, I feel like they got along for the most part, but occasionally they would have quarrels, and of course, the quarrels are that's what makes the history books.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't. Some areas yes, and some no. I mean, particularly in Spain, the bad blood between the various marshals, I think, genuinely hindered the progress.
Right.
And the bad blood between Soult and Ney potentially, you could say potentially impacted Waterloo, because had they been sort of less at loggerheads at other points, would either of them have followed up slightly more diligently with the other and meant that the intel was more accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's just pure speculation. But I mean, if you look at the likes of Davout, he made enemies as easily as he made friends. Most of the other marshals didn't like him.
Right.
They respected him, but he wasn't well liked. Most of them didn't like Murat because they thought he was an idiot.
Yeah. But they attended a lot of, like, balls and fetes, and they hung out with each other, at least in the early part of the empire, quite a bit.
Yeah, they had to be social. They were all nominally social equals, and some of them did have pockets of friendship. Murat and Bessières were very close friends.
Mm-hmm.
Davout and Oudinot were. Davout also did get on with Saint-Cyr.
Mm-hmm.
So you do see these sort of small pockets of friendship. And it's interesting, though, that despite all the quarreling, with the exception of Victor, if you look at how Marmol, if you look at how this sort of contemporary, not counting Kellerman and Perignon, the sort of honorary marshals, if you look at how the sort of contemporary marshals behaved around Ney's trial, I mean, probably nobody would have hated him more than Massena,
Mm-hmm.
who declined to try him.
Right.
I mean, most of the marshals either said, I don't want to be involved, or we don't have capacity to try him.
Right.
They neglected to sort of follow grudges in that circumstance, apart from the pocketful who did vote for Ney's execution.
Right. And I know Ney was a volatile personality to be around, but you're right. That's a great point, that, they all respected him with the exception of the 5 that voted for his death. Yeah, I think that's a great point right there. I just love the Marshall story, all 26 of them, and I'm really glad you joined me for this call. Thank you again for joining me. And I'd like to plug your Twitter page one more time, at bookish_Rachael. And we were sponsored today by our wonderful friends at NapoleonicImpressions.com. Rachael, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.